Moving about in the Chicago metropolitan area could get harder and more expensive. From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, March 7th, 2025. I'm Peter Hancock, and this is Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capital News, Illinois. Public mass transit is a basic ingredient of life in any major city in the world, whether it's the trolley cars in San Francisco, the subways in New York, or the underground as they call it in London. Mass transit is what makes it possible to move about. Because let's face it, there isn't enough asphalt in the world to build all the streets and parking spaces that would be needed if everybody moved about by themselves in their own individual car. In Chicagoland, the mass transit system is made up of many parts. The Chicago Transit Authority runs the famous L trains that crisscross the city, as well as a network of city buses. Metra operates commuter rails that move people between the suburbs and the city, and PACE operates the bus system that moves people around in the suburbs. And overseeing it all is the Regional Transportation Authority, better known as the RTA. But there's a problem. Those four transit systems are facing a $770 million revenue shortfall, and that has put the Chicagoland transit system front and center on the desks of Illinois lawmakers in Springfield, who now have to decide how to keep the wheels moving, so to speak, without disrupting the lives of millions of Chicagoland residents. CNI's Ben Szalinski wrote about this recently, and he's here today to help us unravel this issue. Ben, welcome back.
Good to be back, Peter.
First, I think it's fair to say there are some lawmakers in Springfield, some of them from the Chicago area, some from downstate, who are not exactly thrilled to have this problem landing on their desk. That was evident at a recent legislative hearing that you covered. But before we get to that, let's talk about what's at stake here. A $770 million budget hole, what some people are calling a fiscal cliff. What's at stake in this? What happens if the systems go over that cliff if they can't come up with that money?
Yeah, really what is at stake in summary here is good, reliable public transportation. The RTA has done some research onto this, and if this gap in funding is not filled, that's going to force these agencies to collectively cut service by 40%. So this would change the landscape of Chicagoland public transportation dramatically. There's already lots of complaints that PACE is an unreliable system, Metro trains don't run frequently enough, and the scheduling by the CTA is a complete disaster. Those problems would only get worse if there's no funding to cover this gap. Basically, the issue here is that a lot of money is disappearing in 2026. This is money that these systems got from the federal government as part of COVID-19 recovery. And it really helped these agencies fill a lot of gaps in their budget. It took some of the pressure off of riders. But the only way that they would be able to cover this funding gap in the future is with more fare increases on riders. And that would also make the system largely unsustainable for a lot of people who depend on it.
Okay, so clearly this crisis didn't develop overnight. It had to have been developing over a period of time. These systems, they get money from rider fares, they get subsidies from the state government, the federal government. What's going wrong with the mix of revenue and expenses? How did we get to the situation that we have now?
Yeah, historically, the systems have been required to receive 50% of their operating revenue from rider fares. So riders have been funding about half of all the expenses that the transit systems undertake. Now, when COVID hit, people stopped riding the transit systems, people stopped going to work, stopped leisure activities, and there was no way to sustain any of these budgets with a 50% fare requirement for the budgets. So that requirement was suspended, and in comes federal money from the American Rescue Plan and other federal programs that were allowing the CTA and the other agencies to fill their budgets and fill these holes to continue providing a good, reliable level of service. Now, that money was only meant to last so long, and the remaining dollars that still exist expire this year or in early 2026. And once those dollars go away, there's going to be a big hole for these transit agencies to fill. And if they reinstate this 50% fare box recovery ratio, as it's known, that's going to force riders to pay far more in fares to be able to sustain the same level of service that they are receiving now. And if the fares go up, that means less people are going to be riding it. So it's just a lose-lose situation. And the agencies here are looking for more money to cover this budget gap in order to continue providing the level of service that people expect and more service than the transit agencies already do.
You mentioned the pandemic, and I know this was an issue in a lot of cities all over America and maybe even all over the world. When we had the lockdown, of course, nobody was riding public transit. There was nowhere to go. People were ordered to stay at home, and the systems virtually shut down. Gradually, things reopened, and I can remember a lot of people still being nervous about getting onto crowded buses and trains where people are packed in. We just kind of got conditioned for social distancing to keep your distance away from everybody else. And now we seem to be, life has not really completely returned to normal. A lot of people still work from home at least part of the time, if not all of the time. Has there been maybe a long-term shift in working patterns and commuter patterns such that maybe we can't sustain these mass transit systems under the same formula that we used to have?
Yeah, the ridership, it has recovered. The agencies will say that they've recovered close to 100% of their rider numbers as they had back in 2019 before the pandemic. The problem is when people are riding. And the issue is that people are riding a lot less frequently. So Mondays and Fridays, if you ask Metro and the CTA as well, they will tell you that they see very few riders on Mondays and Fridays because people are working from home. Now, Thursday or Tuesday through Thursday, those are some of the busier days on the transit system because people are going downtown to their offices and they are going in person to work. Metro has also said that they've seen a pretty strong increase in riders on the weekends. Actually, compared to the pandemic, they say they're seeing slightly more riders than they saw on the weekend. So a lot of it has really just been rider habits have changed and people are just going less frequently. So they're not really expecting to see a continued increase in ridership because people just aren't going to work in person at the same level that they were. And they think they've largely kind of maxed out on where ridership is. And that means they've pretty much maxed out on where fares are going to come from unless they increase fares. So that's really kind of the issue here is adjusting this system to meet the new habits of people's public transportation use in a post-pandemic world.
So we have these four agencies between CTA, Metra, PACE, the RTA. What are the issues on the table, and is there any sense about which of these four, or maybe is it all four, that are responsible for this huge fiscal cliff that they're facing?
Yeah, it's all of them combined that are responsible for it. They each used temporary pandemic relief dollars to fill the budget, and those are gone. So that collectively is putting all of these agencies at the front of the blame list, I guess, if you want to call it. The CTA is responsible for more than $600 million of this, but that makes sense given that they are the largest ridership agency. They move upwards of 3/4 of all riders per day in the Chicagoland area. So some of the proposals that are on the table, there's quite a variety. Senator Ron Villivalam, he heads the Senate Transportation Committee. He's introduced a plan that he calls the Metropolitan Mobility Act, which calls for consolidating the service boards of all four of these agencies, but it would give more power to the Cook County and Chicago units of government to appoint members to the single MMA board under his plan. So this plan is receiving a lot of pushback from municipalities in the suburbs because it certainly would dilute the power that suburban county officials have to appoint members to the current boards for Metro, the CTA, PACE, and the RTA if it's combined into one board that actually has more Cook County and Chicago representation. The AFL-CIO, they are behind a labor plan that also calls for some more consolidation. But this plan really relies on coordination between agencies. They want to see better coordination on the services between each agency, such as a metro train is going to stop at the same time a pace bus in the suburbs is going to be able to pick up riders getting off that metro train and take them in a different direction. The labor group also wants to see more universal fares, reducing the fare box ratio in these budgets. And now the RTA also has their own plan. This is Kirk Dillard's plan. He's a former Republican senator. He wants to give more power to the RTA to actually follow through on regional planning and regional oversight. The RTA is actually very limited by state law in anything that they can do. And his plan, it would keep a lot of these service boards together, which is kind of, it seems to be at odds with what a lot of lawmakers want to do. But he thinks that this system will function better if the RTA is responsible for more of the planning and coordination between the three agencies that provide transportation, actually sets fares for riders, and actually sets service standards for riders so that there's more aligned schedules and better schedules that are more reliable for riders.
So it seems like we have all these boards. There's a lot of money and a lot of jobs at stake. It just seems like kind of a classic Chicago political thing where there are going to be turf wars between different boards. I mean, who gets more power, who gets less power in the future. Has it become that kind of a parochial political thing between people battling over turf rather than battling over, what's in the best public interest?
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. I think a lot of people, they want to protect their jobs. If they're part of one of these agencies, they're worried that consolidation is going to cause some of these very lucrative jobs that are, leading these agencies to go away. There's concerns on the union side that there's going to be labor issues if you start combining agencies. There's going to be different labor agreements for each of these, for the employees at each of these organizations. And certainly everybody's got something different they want to see. Chicago lawmakers are a lot more focused on the CTA. Suburban lawmakers are a lot more focused on Metro and Pace, but they want to see better service in the suburbs. And of course, the issue with Senator Willie Velum's bill is that there's a lot of appointment power that would go to the mayor of Chicago and the president of the Cook County Board that would potentially take power away from suburban municipalities. So there's a lot of jockeying around for power in the final say. And it's not really clear what is emerging at the moment, but it certainly seems like lawmakers are eyeing some sort of version of consolidation at the moment, at least.
Okay, and so the big question then is, what's Governor J.B. Pritzker saying about all this? Because I don't remember this coming up during his State of the State / budget speech last month.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people were expecting it to come up, and a reporter did ask him about it after the speech, and he said, basically, we have a long way to go on these discussions. These negotiations are continuing to take place behind closed doors. Lawmakers are still trying to feel out what direction they want to go. And one thing that the governor pointed out is that lawmakers have made it very clear that the state is not going to be appropriating new funding for these agencies unless there's actually substantial reforms made at some of these agencies. And that means improving service, that means improving public safety, especially on the CTA, which has been a big issue. And unless any of these things happen and these transit agencies can commit to reforms that riders have been demanding for years, the state shouldn't feel obligated to put more money into a system that is just not serving the people of Illinois correctly yet. So we don't even know how much the state is going to cover in the $700 million plus gap. It could cover half of it, could cover less, it could cover close to the full amount. That's something we'll see, but it was not part of the governor's budget proposal. So there's clearly a long way to go on these discussions.
Okay, so all of this is by way of setting up what I really wanted to talk about was this legislative hearing that was held recently, where we really saw some of the emotion and some of the animosity and the frustration boiling over. We've got lawmakers who've been hearing complaints from constituents for a long time. Of course, many of them are customers, they're riders of these systems themselves. What sense do you get from them about whether or not they're even willing to get involved in fixing this situation?
It certainly depends, I think, on the individual lawmaker. So, one of the most newsworthy parts of this hearing that you referenced was a House Transportation Appropriations hearing, and Representative Rita Mayfield, a Waukegan Democrat, she is the chair of that committee, and she made her point of view very, very clear. She said
She
that
is known for not really holding back. She's not exactly what you'd call a wallflower.
exactly. And she said it very clearly to RTA Chair Kirk Dillard that, quote, I think we need to blow up the RTA, get rid of everyone, and there's systemic incompetence in the transit system for the last 50 years, alluding to the RTA being created back in the 1980s. She said she doesn't want to keep anybody at the RTA. The leadership needs to be completely removed. And that's her position, is that there should be no RTA, and these transit agencies, she believes, can function by themselves. She asked each one of these transit agencies, do you believe you can function without the help of the RTA overseeing this whole thing? The CTA said yes, and that this is something they've been generally lobbying for, to have more independence from the RTA. Metro gave a little bit more of a mixed response that yes, they financially could do it, but it would cause probably some issues as far as regional planning goes, and they prefer to continue on with the RTA, it seems. So it depends on who you ask, because other lawmakers on that committee certainly alluded to that it's actually better to have a strong RTA. They said, Representative Mayfield's position is not speaking for members of the committee. It's not speaking for all Democrats. So it really just goes to show that there's quite a few different points of view out there.
And speaking of which, this is an issue that has to go through the entire state legislature. And I'm just wondering, if I were a lawmaker from Bloomington or Peoria or East St. Louis or Carbondale, I'd be sitting there saying, why is this landing on my desk? Why do I have to fix this? Do you get any sense from downstate legislators about how willing they are to stick their necks out on a problem that is really a Chicago problem? Or are they just saying, let Chicago fix its own problems?
Yeah, the folks who represent areas outside Chicago have been pretty quiet about this. In this one hearing that we've been talking about, there's several members, all the Republicans on that committee actually are not from the Chicago area. They don't have the RTA region within their districts, but they asked some good pointed questions. They seem to give it the same amount of attention as, any lawmaker from the Chicago area. But I think the thing that they're going to be thinking about is what is in it for them. Now, Chicago is the economic hub of the state, and I think that's going to be part of the consideration for a lot of lawmakers, is that if you have a good, strong public transportation system in the Chicago area, that's good for the state's economy, and it does support the rest of Illinois. But I think there's also going to be kind of a more conservative or laid back point of view from a lot of these downstate lawmakers, in that they're kind of going to let things play out, I think, from the sidelines. They're going to watch it and formulate their opinions and see what's going on and see what proposals ultimately get put on the table and consider how that benefits their district. Now, it's important to point out, I think, and this is what some of the lawmakers from the Chicago area will say when you ask them that question, is that there's a lot of small public transportation agencies in other parts of the state. There's one in the Metro East area. Each of the major cities around the rest of Illinois, from Rockford to Quad Cities, Peoria, Springfield, they all have their own transportation systems as well that deal with some of the same problems, deal with some funding shortfalls and lack of ridership in the post-pandemic world. So I think there's going to be some sort of focus also on some broader statewide public transportation reform, but we really don't know what that's going to look like yet outside the Chicago area.
Okay, well, this is clearly an issue that is not going away anytime soon, probably going to be a key part to wrapping up the end of the session in May, as they're looking to pass a balanced budget and resolve a lot of other issues. So thank you very much for getting us caught up so far on the transit crisis in Chicago.
Thanks, Peter.
And that will do it for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, this is Peter Hancock on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team saying thank you for listening.